Beneath the veil of cobblestone cities and ivy-covered ruins, Europe's mythic past stirs quietly in the shadows. Long before steel swords carved kingdoms and cathedrals clawed at the sky, there were whispers, tales born not of history books, but of trembling voices huddled by firelight. And these whispers, strange and spectral, would echo across generations, shaping not just fear, but identity. You see, Europe is not merely a continent. It is a haunted mirror reflecting centuries of belief, blood, and the eternal struggle to understand the unknown. From the frost-bitten passes of the Carpathians to the damp moss of the Black Forest, the land itself seems to remember. Each tree, each stone, each gust of wind carries the residue of a forgotten truth. In these woods, reality folds at the edges, and through the cracks, something ancient leaks through. It's here, in this thick silence of pre-modern Europe, that our journey into mythology truly begins. Not with fairy dust and charming tales, but with shrieking banshees, bone-chilling omens, and gods that demand a price. Magic in this world was never gentle. It was raw, sacred, and feared. Picture a small village in the highlands of Scotland, smoke curling from the thatch, livestock restless, and an eerie mist sliding low across the moors. The year is 1347. The Black Death has arrived, but before it does, the people know, not from science, but from the keening wail of the Bean Ye, a spectral washerwoman seen scrubbing bloodied clothes by the river, weeping for those who are not yet dead. She is not a ghost of the past. She is a messenger of what's coming, and that belief, unshakable, unprovable, governs how these people survive, or don't. Because in Europe's darkest hours, myth was not just storytelling. It was survival, it was meaning, it was the only defense against a world that refused to be explained. Move south to Italy, and we find whispers of the Benandanti, peasant warriors who claim to fight witches in their dreams, leaving their bodies behind to wage astral battles for the souls of their communities. To the Inquisition, they were heretics, but to their neighbors, they were protectors. Their dreams were not merely sleep, they were battlegrounds. This belief in dream magic, in soul travel, was not just tolerated, it was crucial. Because in a time when plague, famine, and fire could erase a town overnight, you needed to believe that someone, anyone, was fighting back, even if only in the unseen realms. But belief, like power, is dangerous when challenged. In Germany's forests, the stories grew darker. The tale of the Notkrop, an enormous black bird with iron talons that ripped open children who refused to sleep, was more than a bedtime warning. It was the embodiment of collective anxiety, a land where superstition and suffering fermented together until they birthed monsters. And these monsters were not just metaphors, they were real to the people who feared them, real enough to influence behavior, real enough to keep villages silent during storms, and real enough to justify the cruelest acts of discipline and control. Because when terror is part of your daily bread, myth becomes law. In France, during the reign of Louis XIV, royal physicians still clung to alchemy and bloodletting, believing that illness was an imbalance of humors or a punishment from God. The king himself, a man who called himself the Sun, was surrounded by rituals of divinity, touched only by gilded hands, treated by men who swore mercury could purify the soul. They bled him, blistered him, poisoned him with opium and lead, all in the name of ancient science twisted by myth. And the irony? These treatments, steeped in medieval mysticism, often killed more surely than the disease itself. But to question the ritual was to question order. And in Europe, especially in royal courts, order was everything. Further west, in the rolling green of Ireland, the fair folk, commonly known as fairies, were not charming little sprites but feared entities of great power and deadly mood. It was said they could steal babies, curse crops, or cause madness with a single glance. Farmers left out offerings of cream and bread on Samhain night, not out of niceness, but to avoid wrath. Roads were rerouted around fairy forts, ancient stone circles believed to be portals to their world. Even the church hesitated to interfere too strongly, for the old ways had teeth, and many clergy, publicly dismissive, privately feared what might happen if the balance was disturbed. All across Europe, the line between myth and medicine, religion and ritual was paper thin. Women who brewed herbal remedies were midwives to some, witches to others. A tincture that cured fever in one village might see a woman burned alive in another. The same plant that symbolized healing in a monastery garden could be accused of devil's work if found in the wrong hands. Power, it seems, lay not in the plant, but in the perception, and perception, like myth, is shaped by fear. In Prague, stories tell of the golem, a creature of clay brought to life by sacred letters and hidden knowledge, created by a rabbi to protect the Jewish ghetto from violence. The golem stood as a figure of divine rebellion. He was not made for beauty or wonder, but for vengeance. His fists cracked stone. His presence kept blood-hungry mobs at bay. But even the golem, protector of the innocent, had to be destroyed. Because no man should control creation itself, even the act of defending the weak became suspect when it defied the sanctioned powers of the time. Europe's legends are not just quaint tales passed down through generations. They are scars carved into culture, shaped by hunger, war, disease, and despair. They are the echoes of villages long buried, of prayers whispered to gods that no longer have names. And behind every story of a banshee or bogeyman, behind every ritual dance or whispered curse, there is a deeper truth. Humanity has always been terrified of the dark, and so we gave it a name, we gave it wings, we gave it claws, and in doing so we made it familiar, bearable, tangible, because nothing is more terrifying than the unknown. But here's the paradox. These myths, these twisted stories forged in suffering, also gave people hope. Hope that something beyond the veil was listening. That the world was not just random cruelty, but a theater of gods and monsters with rules that could be bent, or at least bargained with. To believe in magic, however cruel, was to believe that pain had meaning, that fate was not blind, that somewhere, someone was watching. And that was enough to keep going. And so we descend deeper, where shadows grow colder, and myths bleed into the bones of the earth. What began as whispers around fires and prayers under breath now becomes a doctrine of terror and wonder, a mythology not told by the victors, but by those who endured. Part 2 of our journey winds us through the twisted corridors of power, obsession, and forgotten rituals, where myth was no longer just survival, but control, because those who shaped belief could shape entire empires. And Europe, fractured by war and drenched in superstition, became a crucible where fear was weaponized and myth became the machinery of domination. Step into the cathedrals of medieval Spain, not as a tourist, but as a soul trembling before the Inquisition. You hear the slow creak of the doors, the echo of chains, the whispered Latin of hooded men. You've been accused, not of murder or theft, but of practicing old ways, lighting candles on solstice nights, carving symbols into bread, or speaking in the tongue of your ancestors. Heresy, they say, witchcraft. The inquisitors don't need proof, they have testimony, and testimony, under torture, always gives them what they want. Because the truth didn't matter. What mattered was obedience, and in the fires that followed, the old gods screamed, not because they were burned, but because they were remembered. In the cold north, Scandinavia still remembers the Sami shamans, spiritual guides who drummed their way into trance, speaking to reindeer spirits and sky beings long before Christ ever walked on frozen ground. The church labeled them heathens, but the reindeer didn't care. The winds still listened. And even as missionaries arrived with crosses and Latin Bibles, the Sami kept their drums. secretly, desperately, because to them these rituals weren't myths, they were conversations. Life itself was a dialogue between the seen and unseen. To sever that connection was to go blind in a world already cloaked in ice. In the great courts of Europe, myth wore a different face, one gilded in gold and drowning in blood. Take Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, a woman who surrounded herself with astrologers, alchemists, and poisoners. She held seances in secret chambers. She consulted the stars before diplomacy. And it wasn't just eccentricity, it was strategy. Because in a court where betrayal came with wine and smiles, Catherine used fear as her armor. She understood that belief in the occult was not just superstition, it was influence. If they thought she could speak to the dead, perhaps they would hesitate before crossing her, and many did. Meanwhile, in the countryside, the people suffered under a different kind of curse: crop failure, disease, wolves in the woods, and taxes that strangled entire villages. They turned not to kings, but to cunning folk, the wise women and weather witches. They mixed herbs with chants, read omens in bird flight, and offered protection charms made of bone, ash, and salt. For many they were the only hope, and for that they were hunted. In 1589, the North Berwick witch trials began in Scotland, and the stories were horrific. Women accused of summoning storms to drown King James's ship, tortured until they named others. Some confessed to impossible crimes, dancing with the devil beneath the moon, feeding familiars from open wounds, flying on broomsticks smeared with fat. Of course, none of it was true. The truth was irrelevant. These were not trials. They were purges of the old world, ritual slaughter dressed in holy robes. And yet, the myths persisted. In Transylvania, the legend of Dracula took root, not from fiction, but from the blood-soaked deeds of Vlad the Impaler, a warlord so brutal his name became folklore. He dined among impaled corpses, drove iron stakes through thousands, and claimed to defend Christendom against the Ottomans. But to his enemies he was no protector. He was a monster, a vampire long before the novels. And the land remembered. The forests there still feel heavy, as if watching. Locals still leave garlic at windows, and while tourists flock to Bran Castle for selfies, some villages quietly lock their doors at dusk, just in case the old stories were true. And perhaps some of them are. Because history has never been clean. It is blood under fingernails, ash on the tongue, breath caught between prayer and panic. And myth? Myth is the memory of that chaos, shaped into something we can carry. It explains the unexplainable. Why the baby died in the night. Why the harvest rotted. Why men with crowns turned to beasts. Myth says, there is meaning even in suffering. But the dark side of that belief is this: if suffering has meaning, then punishment must be deserved, and so the accused were branded not just guilty, but cursed, touched by demons, marked by fate. Even in the Enlightenment, the so-called Age of Reason, Europe could not shake its mythic roots. In 1764, in the French province of Gévaudan, something strange began. A beast, massive, swift, and unstoppable, terrorized the countryside. It killed over 100 people, mostly women and children, always at dusk. Witnesses described a monstrous wolf, but larger than any known species, with eyes like fire and fur that repelled bullets. The king sent hunters. The church called it divine punishment. The people whispered of werewolves. And to this day, the beast of Gévaudan remains unexplained. But here's the truth. No matter what it was, the story mattered more than the creature. Because in that fear, the myths came back to life, and they gave shape to chaos. Even today, the echoes linger. Stand in the ruined abbeys of England, where monks once prayed beneath crumbling vaults. Look up, and you'll see gargoyles, not just for rain, but for warding spirits. Beneath them, the tombs of knights who once swore oaths by sword and blood. Many believed their souls could be trapped, forced to roam until appeased, and in certain villages, people still bury the dead with coins, with salt, with iron nails. Ancient customs long outlawed, yet stubbornly alive, because deep down we know myths don't die. They wait, buried beneath cathedrals and castles, humming quietly beneath pavement and neon, waiting for a crack in the modern world, a moment of weakness, a new darkness. Then they rise again, and when they do, we will call them stories. But they will remember, doesn't bury, it conceals. Like mist curling over graves, it hides what it cannot destroy. And in the ancient bones of Europe's myths, something still breathes, something watching, waiting, because myth was never just in the past. It followed us, evolved, shifted shape. In part 1, we wandered through primal forests and whispered legends that guided and terrified. In part 2, we saw myth forged into instruments of power, burning, bleeding, conquering under banners of both crown and cross. But now, in part 3, we enter the final realm, the aftermath, the forgotten corners, the modern world still haunted by stories it dares not speak aloud, where science rules by day, but something older still walks at night. The Enlightenment gave us telescopes, medicine, machines. It chased the shadows with logic, and yet ghost stories never vanished. The old rituals went underground, not away, and in many places they grew teeth. Take Eastern Europe, lands shattered by war, famine, and political terror. In the early 18th century, a panic gripped Serbia, Wallachia, and parts of Hungary. The dead, people believed, were not staying dead. Corpses were exhumed. Some were found bloated, bloodied at the mouth. Locals were certain. Vampires. The solution? A stake through the heart. The state sent soldiers to intervene, but these were not peasants ruled by fear. These were people who had seen loved ones die in agony, and then something else. Something returned. Even enlightened minds like Voltaire noted these vampire cases, mocking them, yet unable to explain why they were spreading. You don't stake a corpse unless you're sure it needs to be stopped. But the deeper truth? Myth fills what reason cannot reach. Across the English countryside in the 19th century, rumors of the Black Shuck, an enormous spectral hound, persisted long after industrial chimneys blackened the skies. It was said to be a harbinger of death. Eyewitnesses claimed it shattered church doors, left no tracks, and vanished into thin air. Sailors, miners, farmers, all told the same tale. These were not uneducated villagers, they were witnesses. Some stories said it was the ghost of a dog killed in a massacre, others that it guarded sacred sites desecrated by conquest. But whatever the truth, it haunted minds, because even in the age of steel and steam, people still felt watched, still feared what couldn't be measured. And it wasn't just in the country. In Victorian London, a new horror arrived. Not from legend, but from headlines. Spring-heeled Jack, a leaping, fire-breathing figure dressed in a cloak and tight suit, said to have metal claws and a terrifying shriek. Women fainted, children screamed. The police were powerless. Some thought it a ghost, others a demon. Some swore it was a prankster in costume, but the sightings were so numerous, so specific, they couldn't be dismissed. Even Queen Victoria was briefed. The terror reached such a pitch that armed mobs patrolled the streets. And while Spring-heeled Jack eventually faded, he proved something chilling. Myth doesn't need centuries to grow. Sometimes, all it needs is fear. And what is fear but a story we tell ourselves to make sense of danger? In Germany, the Brothers Grimm collected tales once told only in hushed tones. But what they published was far darker than the fairy tales we remember. Girls burned alive for lighting candles, children baked into pies, forests where witches wore human skin. These were not meant for comfort. They were warnings, codes, blueprints for surviving a brutal world where parents died young, Kings took what they pleased, and famine lived just outside the window. The Grimm brothers didn't invent these stories. They recorded them, preserved them, and in doing so revealed that myth was the true folklore of trauma. And then the 20th century came. The wars, the madness, the machines. Myth was supposed to die here. Auschwitz, Dresden, the Somme. These were human horrors. No magic, no demons, only men. But even then, whispers returned. The idea of the curse of the Nazi gold, the obsession Hitler had with the spear of destiny, the lance said to have pierced Christ, the secret societies hunting relics, conducting rituals, fusing occult belief with genocide. These were not fabrications. Nazi leadership genuinely consulted astrologers, dowsers, ancient texts. Why? Because even in their twisted cruelty, they believed myth could bring power, and the world, for a time, watched as that belief devoured continents. After the war, the myths didn't stop. In rural Romania, villagers still drove iron stakes into the corpses of suspected strigoi, restless dead said to rise and drink blood from their kin. This happened not in the Middle Ages, but in the 1990s, because when modern medicine fails, when grief chokes reason, myth steps in. A 76-year-old man dies suddenly. His niece claims to see him standing at the foot of her bed, mouth open, eyes burning. The family digs him up. They find his body fresh. They cut out his heart, burn it, and mix the ashes in water to drink, a ritual as old as Rome. It made the international news, but for the villagers, it was never a story. It was protection. In Ireland, even now, roads are still rerouted to avoid disturbing fairy forts. In Iceland, entire building projects are delayed out of respect for elves said to inhabit certain lava fields. These are not tourist gimmicks. These are cultural truths, deep, lived, and unshaken by modernity. Because belief is not bound by Wi-Fi signals or satellite maps. It's older, deeper. It lives in the soil. And what of today? We think we've outgrown myth, but it's still with us. In conspiracy theories that twist old fears into new monsters. In urban legends that spread like wildfire across the internet. In stories of sleep paralysis demons, Black Knight children, the Slender Man. Made up, perhaps, but real in their impact. Real in the fear they cause. Real in the way they echo something far older, our need to name the darkness, because that's what myth has always done. In the end, Europe's myths are not relics, they are reflections, not of the supernatural, but of us, of our grief, our hunger, our cruelty, our awe. Every banshee scream, every vampire's shadow, every child lost in the woods, it all tells the same truth. We are fragile, we are afraid, and we are desperate to believe that something bigger, something stranger is out there, watching, punishing, saving. And maybe, just maybe, the myths were never wrong. Maybe the forest is alive. Maybe the dead don't always stay buried. Maybe the old gods are only sleeping. Maybe that shadow outside your window is looking back.